Peace and blessings, family. This is your brother Asarimhotep with the Mandela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. I'm coming to you once again to continue our conversation on defining what a husband and a wife is within its African context, and to try to answer the question, is the man supposed to be the breadwinner of the family? And so on yesterday, Thursday, June 1st, I did a brief presentation, about 24 minutes, and I'm going to continue that. I want to keep them in small chunks so that y'all have time to digest it and listen to it without, interrupting significantly your day. So I'm just going to get right into it. And so as I have a presentation, so I have to share my screen and all that good stuff. And I just want to thank you all again for joining us, those who are live and those who will catch me later. And so let me do this now. And excuse me. Where is there we go. Okay. So give it a second. Hopefully it shows up good. I have my other computer on the side here, so I'm looking to just make sure that everything is all right. So sorry for the delay. And if you have any questions, throughout, please enter them in the chat, and if you're not watching this live, put it in the comments box, and I will try to answer it in a timely fashion. But to continue, what is a husband and a wife? An African answer, part 2. The central question being, is the man supposed to be the breadwinner? And as I discussed yesterday, my answer lies in defining what is a husband and a wife from an African perspective. And this is a part of a process which I call Umoja. And Umoja is a Chibantu language word that means to make, provide, to retrace one step, to refer to a place of origin, and to restore. The objective is to strengthen and restore our indigenous conceptualizations about reality as a result of the transatlantic slave Holocaust. And so the cognate in the ancient Egyptian language is this word rouge in the phrase serouge, S being a causative prefix, meaning to make, secure, to set right or wrong, provide, fulfill a contract, to restore, repair, to make new again, to make, grow, and flourish. So our focus today is on, Black love and relationships. And so this is something that we want to make, grow, and flourish, and to repair, again, as a result of the transatlantic slave Holocaust and the subsequent Jim Crow and other things that have contributed to us having a warped sense of, what it means to relate to one another. And so I hope that, this contributes to the greater narrative and the restoring of our orientation, towards African thought and values. And so much of this discussion is kind of a combination of 2 of my books, and that is the 2015 Where is the Love? How Language Can Reorient Us Back to Love's Purpose, and Nesubiti King in Ancient Egyptian, A Lesson in Paronymy and Leadership. Both of these texts, deal with community building in one way or another. And so, for references and things of that nature, please consult these works. And if you purchase them from my website at www.asarimhotep.com for a limited time, there's free shipping in the United States. So you just pay for the text and don't worry about shipping. It'll be sent out to you promptly. So we'll continue now. And so I just want to kind of recap what we talked about yesterday. And so what I mentioned yesterday in part 1 of this video is that, you know, a husband and a wife are just kind of really different terms or gendered terms for a root that means a man, person, or human being, but not just any man, person, or human being in terms of just the idea, but more so an active living body. And so this root here is just one example of many that we could use, but for time's sake, I chose this root here. The word at the top, the H with the dot under it and M, is an ancient Egyptian word that has based, more than likely, because they did not write out their vowels, different vowels built off of a central lexical theme. And so this hem root, historically, when we go further than ancient Egypt to its pre-dialectical parent, is ultimately a word for tree and tree branch. And from this word comes a variety of different ideas. And so from this concept of tree and tree trunk comes this notion of the body, the human body, just like the trunk is the body of the tree. And from there, the concept of a human being. And so what we have here in the second column really should go under the first, but for the sake of space, you know, I put it into its own column. But, you know, this concept of a king, which in Africa could be a male or a female, or a god or a husband or a wife, is built off of this same root in terms of a tree, trunk, body, and able body, you know, man or person. And so a slightly different trajectory off of the same theme, because you have able body in one context, and then you have this notion from tree and tree branch to the word for arm that means power and to do work. And from this notion of power and doing work, you get a word for like servant or a craftsman or somebody who is skilled or a priest. And so all of these ideas combined when you're talking about a husband or a wife. See, a husband or a wife is just a male or a female within the context of a marriage. So these are able-bodied workers, servants, priests that exist together within the context of a marriage. So I also mentioned yesterday that the HM sequence is also inversed to give us a slightly different semantic shading, you know, on that common theme of being able to work or being able to do. So within that context, you have the syllable switched. So it's, instead of HM, you have MH. And you can see these variants here. They're all meaning to care for, to be concerned about. A priest is somebody who just is a servant or a caretaker of a particular, or an expert in a particular field or guild or something to this nature. And so a guardian is in that same context because they observe and take care of folks. And so, you know, within the context of a guardian, you also have a nurse or a doctor. And then because that same root is built upon this notion of a skill set, you know, we had this last word, mehu, meaning hunter, and fish spearer. And so all of these are built off the same root, the same thing. So we have, you know, also within that discussion from yesterday, I gave a Chiluba example from this same root with a slightly different dialectical pronunciation, but the word is mukubi, you know, a priest, and which comes from a root kuba, meaning being protected or take care of, ensuring, monitor, observe. Bukubi, guard, monitoring, treatment, health care, key word here. Dikuba, care, protection, to protect yourself, to care. Meh, care again. Mehi, to care for, to be concerned about. These are Egyptian words now. mehe, guardian, as we said again. And so when it's inversed again with the T suffix, we have a word meaning support or a post. So you can see this determinative here at the end is a piece of wood, a tree branch. And so is this club here. This is, it comes from a word meaning wood, tree, and then some other ideas come from it. So just like how a tree branch or a trunk supports like a home or a building or something to this nature, it also symbolically holds this notion of support in the same context of care and protection and things of that nature. So you have another root here, him, give, protection, defend. So we can say for sure that meh and him are essentially the same word, just inverse to give slightly different semantic shading. So within that, when we combine all of that, we say that a husband and a wife, which is an able-bodied man or woman who exists within a context of a marriage or who are married to each other, essentially for each other, they are sources of protection and a source of health care. And so whatever protection and health care means within the context of a relationship, that's why we get somebody to be that primary or consistent source within the context of a marriage. And so this isn't the agency or the job of one gender. This is not the job of a woman, or is not the job of a man. These are the jobs for both of them, for each other, and then if they have children, of course, for the children, to be a source of protection and healthcare. That's what this all ultimately boils down to. And so we got to keep this in mind as we move forward. And so now what I want to do is kind of lean off of the linguistic tip and get into some like sociological discussion. And so this next section, of course, I have titled The Myth of the Male Breadwinner. And a leading text that discusses this very well is from this professor here, Stephanie Kuntz, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. She is the director of research and public education at the Council on Contemporary Families and teaches history and family studies at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. She has written many texts, many articles, and if you search her name on YouTube, you will find many interviews and lectures by her expanding what we're about to discuss today. So I just only want to mention for that is relevant to this discussion is her text, The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap. And so essentially her objective is to debunk this notion of American, a traditional American family and family values. And she goes through the historical data to show how things have changed and what they really were and when things changed and why, and how some of these ideas have even reversed on themselves back and forth continually over time. And so it is a real interesting and thought-provoking book. So I recommend that everyone get it. And so I just want to highlight some of the ideas that were brought out in this text. And that is, of course, male breadwinner, that the male breadwinner is a myth. And we'll get into that, a little bit more down the line. She claims also that, and we got to keep in mind that her data set is, European settled Americans. And so this is American values, which is really an extension of European values and culture and history. So she's not analyzing indigenous, Native American, or African or Asian varieties of family and values. So this is going to be important because a lot of our ideas of family, of course, come from these Anglo-Saxon, you know, Puritan and just European conceptualizations of family. And they conflict with us and bring about certain disharmonies, you know, within our social structure. And so we got to recognize where the source is and why they may not be a fit for us. And so within that context, she argues that males essentially were the bosses of the family workforce. See, families worked, not just men. The woman worked and the children worked. And so as the male basically being the boss of the family workforce, the women and children were the unpaid employees, according to her wording. And so it is so much so that back in the day, a wife was essentially called a yoke mate or a deputy husband. Now, a yoke mate, when you look up that word, it means basically kind of a companion or associate, especially at work. So essentially a co-worker. And then from there, it derived to mean to be associated with a spouse. But essentially a yoke mate is somebody who you work with. So now she goes on to say basically that it wasn't until the 1920s that a bare majority of American children came to live in a family where the husband earned the income. The wife was not working beside him in a small business or on a farm or earning income herself. And the children were either at home or in school and not working in a factory or in the fields. So remember that, you know, we're coming from kind of a mixed society, from, you know, Europeans being kind of a mix of nomadic pastoralists and, you know, of course, them adopting farming from groups who migrated out of the Middle East. So there was no such thing as public schools. You know, school was something for the privilege that you had to pay for. And so kids, for the most part, were in the fields working, and so were the women. And so the businesses were family businesses. And so everyone worked. But once the industrialization age came in, they still had these other tendencies, these historical tendencies, which is why children, you know, weren't in school. They were in the factories and stuff working. But then laws started being passed where we had labor laws for children and a set age that they can be able to work. And so when the children stopped working in the factories and stuff like this, of course, they had to be home. And so now we get this public school system, and now they're going to school. And so when they're not home, when they're at home, who's watching the children? That's when you start to see in a little bit of the wife staying home longer or more, because someone has to watch the children. And so because of the industrialization ness of the American economic structure, some things started to shift. And so it really kind of culminated in the early 1920s, where you start to see this dynamic in the family change. She's going to say that the family form that grew less, that family, or what we just mentioned earlier, that family form then grew less common during the Great Depression and the World War II. So we're talking about 1930s, 1940, 45, in that time period. But it reappeared in the 1950s, thanks to an unusual economic and political situation in which real wages were rising steadily and a government flush with cash was paying veterans benefits to 44% of young men starting families. This was a period when your average 30-year-old man could buy a home on 15% to 18% of his own salary, not needing his wives. So the dynamic of the economy changed, which allowed for this to happen. And so we have a combination of, you know, children needing to be taken care of because they're not working. of age. So we're not just talking about, of course, reasonably when a child is very young. We're talking, like age 0 to, 7, let's say. Like these are really young kids. Of course, someone has to have consistent care for someone that young. But like 7 on up, you was working, but now they're in school and things of this nature. And so you have this, rise in not working mothers, but, stay-at-home moms. But even then, because of government programs, basically because of welfare, they won't label it as such, but it's essentially government welfare. It allowed the men to take care of home on less. And you got to remember that, the value of $1 was less then, and we got to equate for all of that. Inflation was lower, stuff of that nature. And so, within that context of yesterday's discussion, we see kind of the same thing in ancient Egypt. So in ancient Egypt, you saw that men and women were working together in terms of their household. And the example I gave is this image here, which you can find on my book, which is Where is the Love? How Language Can Reorient Us Back to Love's Purpose. And it is, these ideas. So you got to remember that a marriage is a very old thing. And it came about as a result of, I'm not going to say because of agriculture, but because of this notion that we have to survive, and it's better to survive with someone else than it is as an individual out in this world. So this goes back to a time which is we can't count, but it's within that context that you have a marriage, because the person is supposed to be a helpmate. And so you live this life and you have aspirations, or if you believe in a divine purpose, but you need help along the way, because the world is going to send challenges which is hard to overcome, by oneself. So we unite with each other to make life easier. But it's not the case that one person does all the work while the other person just sit back and looks pretty. And this is coming from discussions I've been seeing on social media, in videos lately, where they're arguing about men being the sole breadwinner, without any historical context of where these ideas come from. So even Diop, when talking about the African context, talks about the material factors that led to the elevated status of women in ancient Egypt compared to their Indo-European counterparts. Now, we got to remember that ancient Egypt was primarily an agrarian society. And so these agrarian societies are kind of built differently than ones that have developed over time from nomadic pastoralism, like the Proto-Indo-Europeans were. And so he says in The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, in fact, it is only in this framework that the wife can, in spite of her physical inferiority, contribute substantially to the economic life. She even becomes one of the stabilizing elements in her capacity as mistress of the house and keeper of the food. And so because of her economic contributions, she became essential to the household beyond, raising the children and pleasing her man. She becomes a stabilizing force in the household. And so we'll get into why this is important a little later. And so these are some of the issues that I have with the male as the breadwinner myth. As I first state, one, it is a very recent Eurocentric concept that even for Europeans is outdated. So when we discuss that book, for example, from Dr. Kuntz, she's reminding people that this is a new phenomenon is, coming from the late 1800s, early 1900s, that is not traditional in a sense, and that it has outlived its usefulness. So it's not even useful for Europeans, but you have black folks trying to live up to the standard. And so it is outdated, and it is not from our, cultural ideals and milieu. Secondly, it doesn't make much sense. Why? In part because women lose their value. Because you got to think about it like this. If I'm a man and I am to be responsible solely for not only my uptake and well-being, but the woman's solely, and of course the children, if we were to, go that far and have children, the question I would have is, what need do I have of a wife in the first place? What is your purpose outside of sexual pleasure? You as a woman, you as a wife, lose value when the man is the sole breadwinner. And number three is related to number two, and that is women essentially give up their power under this dynamic. And what do I mean by this? Think about it in the context of a business, which a marriage is. The owner of a business has more leverage and more power than an employee. Why? Because the owner of the business is the one who put all the time and money in creating the business and system. Because he's the one or she's the one who poured all of the resources to make this thing happen, and you come later in the mix, the power automatically, of course, is going to go to the owner. And so essentially you become an employee. You have a power differential dynamic going on when you expect your man to be the sole breadwinner, which causes other problems in the relationship. And we know that we can't have it both ways. And so also, if let's say that there was a partnership in the business, now the owner one is not going to have the same power dynamic as an employee, as the owner versus employee with owner number two, because they are equals, in the business, and have put in equal ways in the starting and the growth of this business. They have to operate with each other a little differently. And so the other can't command and demand the other to do anything. They work together for the sake of the growth and health of the business. And that's essentially a marriage. And that's what it's supposed to be when it comes to our intimate relationships. And lastly, it deteriorates, we're talking about this paradigm, this myth of the breadwinner, men's health. And so with that, I would like to just throw a few articles your way. And so, in what ways does the man being the sole breadwinner or being expected to be the breadwinner due to his health? And so you'll find a number of articles and studies which demonstrate this. And so here's a live science article titled Breadwinner Men May Have More Money but Poorer Health. And so it goes on to state, men who earn more money than their wives may be rolling in the bucks, but they tend to have poor health and heightened anxiety, new research shows. Researchers analyzed surveys from 9,000 young married men and women in the United States taken annually over a 15-year period, and evaluated each participant's response on income, health, and psychological wellness. They found that the more economic responsibility a man had in his marriage, the more his psychological well-being and health declined. The findings suggest that men who are primary breadwinners and who in essence fulfill the culturally held expectation that husbands should bring home more money than their wives are actually worse off than men who earn salaries that are more equal to those of their wives. In other words, their wives contribute just as equally as theirs. And so from the same article, it says, our study contributes to a growing body of research that demonstrates the ways in which gendered expectations are harmful for men too. Study co-author Christian Munch, if I'm saying that correctly, an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut, said in the statement, men are expected to be the breadwinners, yet providing for one's family with little or no help has negative repercussions. And so remember what I said, what we came to earlier in terms of what is a husband and what is a wife. They're supposed to be a source of health care. So if this dynamic deteriorates one's health, then obviously on the male side, it diminishes his ability to be a healthcare provider because of his diminishing health. And then the so-called wife then becomes a source for basically disease, which we see here, you know, from these unrealistic expectations that are, you know, built from a myth that really never existed, you know, historically. And so it continues under the subheading of manly pressures. Perhaps men's health and psychological wellness would improve if they weren't subjected to the macho breadwinner paradigm. The researcher said, while some male gender cultural mores have waned, for instance, fathers are increasingly expected to care for children and help with household chores, the cultural expectation that men should earn more than their wives persists, the researcher said. And so, you know, linked in that same article is this article talking about unequal division of labor in a marriage, you know, ups the risk of divorce. And so when the marriage is not ma'at, when it's not balanced, you know, you increase the risk of divorce. But I'll let y'all read that on your own because it goes into a slightly different dynamic than what we have here, but it's ultimately related to the previous article. And so I'll let that be there. And then I'm just going to go to the next one. Being sole breadwinner is bad for men's health, but good for women. Why is it good for women? So just some highlights from the text. It says the rise of women in the workplace has often been blamed for making men feel sidelined, emasculated, and unsure of their role in the family. But a new study suggests that being the sole breadwinner is bad for a man's mental and physical health, and sharing the financial burden brings long-term benefits to well-being. In contrast, women's mental health benefits from being the only provider, with their overall emotional health and happiness declining as they contributed less to the household. The U.S. researchers conclude that cultural expectations have left men viewing breadwinning as an obligation they must fulfill, while women see it as an achievement. And the reason why women see it as an achievement is because more historically within, of course, Eurocentric societies, they were not allowed to participate in the greater society the way that men were. So, you know, they see it as being on par with men in essence, but this is really only within the context of a marriage, because the reason why is they don't have the same stigma as a man. Like if a woman wants to be a homebody or a housewife or something like this, or she wants to go out and earn, you know, money, and if she, you know, even earns more than her man, either way it goes, it's acceptable for women. But that's not the case with men. You know, if women make more than their man, socially we're talking about here, and if he wants to be a stay-at-home dad, there's a stigma in terms of his manhood being diminished as a result on taking on those tasks for whatever reason. And so, you know, their health increases because they're seeing this as being able to, you know, be more responsible and be engaged in the larger contribution of society. But you know, for men, it still continues stress, because if your woman makes more than you, then you got to work harder to make more money than her, so you can be put back in a position, you know what I'm saying, of being the quote unquote head of the household. And so it's a back and forth that ultimately deteriorates the man's psychological well-being and his physical health. And so I want to kind of switch gears a little bit. This excerpt here is from Dr. Troy Allen, who recently passed. His text called, you know, the ancient Egyptian family. And so, you know, it's interesting, for example, that there is no word for marriage in the ancient Egyptian language. And, you know, when I thought about that, I actually went to look on the reliefs, just, you know, hundreds of reliefs, and I have yet to find even a wedding ceremony in ancient Egypt. But that's a, you know, saying a different conversation. But, you know, because they didn't have a marriage, they had this other phrase and concept, which I'll quote now. He says the Egyptians used the term, you know, gereg or gereg per, which means, or which simply means to found or establish your household. And a man and a woman became married by setting up a house together. Again, this marriage is about, you know, coming together as able bodies to create something larger than what you could have done by yourself. And so we've made marriage these other things than what it was initially primarily, and we have suffered as a result of it. But in the African traditions, and we can cite other sources for other areas of Africa, and we'll see the same reality, with the exception of certain pastoralist societies. And, you know, we can get into that maybe in a part 3. Now, it's interesting, this one little quote here from Prince Harjajef from the Old Kingdom. He says, when you prosper, found your household, take a hearty wife. And this is from an instruction text to his son, or is it to him? It's one of the two. A son will be born to you. It is for the son that you build a house. In other words, you create an institution in wealth, so there's something that you can pass on to your children, so that they have something to start off and contribute for when they get married. And so, you know, we come together to help in part build, not only for ourselves, but to help build generational wealth. And so, you know, I'm coming to a close, and I just want to remind people of what love is. And so, you know, as I stressed in the book, you know, love is work. It is a verb. It's something you do. It's not a feeling. And so I've defined it based on my linguistic analysis in this longer excerpt here, that it is the principal actions that one does in the spirit of truth, charity, thanksgiving, generosity, care, concern, purity, beauty, goodness, harmony, elegance, and excellence. In other words, ma'at, for another human being, the rest of nature, and the divine, that adds life to life. This is the key here. When I come together with a woman, or a woman comes together with me, we're supposed to add life to each other's life. We're supposed to enhance it, increase one's healing powers. And so if we're put in a situation where we can't add life to each other, then we have a problem. And so this myth of the male breadwinner forces upon the couple a power dynamic, which brings about other issues in the relationship. And you want something that is more harmonious and something that is more equal, to where that everybody is valued equally, and that everyone makes a contribution equally, and that it expands in a way that, you know, of course, after you leave, that your children, if you choose to have children, can prosper off of y'all love. And so we must go back to thinking of a marriage as a way to add life to life. And so I've also defined in the text, you know, a marriage as simply being a mutual benefits institute. And so if we are not mutually benefiting from this relationship, remember one of the problems that I have. If I am supposed to be the sole breadwinner and contributor to the relationship, I have no need for a wife because I can do all of that by myself. She does not add to me. She does not benefit me in that way. And so the only way that she benefit, not the only way, a major way in which she benefits me and I benefit her is if we contribute equally. That we have these larger than life goals and we help each other to fulfill our life purposes. But the marriage is an institute and it should be mutually beneficial. And so we term that ma'at in ancient Egyptian language. And I actually know this couple in the picture from H-Town. Anyway, and so the lesson that we should learn from this discussion, ultimately, to use the words of Dr. Dika Kilimanjaro and Ife Kilimanjaro, who we see in this picture here, who are one part of a collective. Shout out as well to Brother Yara Aneb. You know, there's Hetshut Ma'at, you know, and other elders who are involved, Tigamba Heru, that are part of a collective, the University of Kemet Press, who have, you know, released around 16 or 17 books within like the past 5 years on various things. And one of the things that they always stress ultimately is that teams win. And so if we believe in this so-called game of life, you know, the only way that we're going to win is together. And so we need to have a different attitude coming into these relationships. And if we come into this into these relationships that teams win, then we'll be able to more efficiently and effectively, you know, tower over the obstacles and challenges of life. And so I will end right there, that discussion, that part of the discussion. And I appreciate everyone for listening to me, viewing this. Hold on. Viewing this. I'm missing something here. Let me see. There we go. I'm sorry. Viewing this presentation. And if you have any, you know, questions or comments, I'm now about to focus and go into the chat room and to see if there are any comments or questions. So I got to roll up. So excuse me for a second as I go through this. Let me see. And if you have any questions, and I'm gonna wait because I understand there's a time lag, you know, between what I'm saying and what y'all hear for those who are live, you know. So I'll wait a few moments, you know. Let me see. No questions as of yet. And so if I don't have any questions, you know, I will end this conversation. So it's only a few of us. I'm doing this in the middle of the day. Usually I do them late at night, but I know people at work and stuff like that. And so if there's no questions in the chat, I want to first just shout out some of the people who are in the chat. We have Kwanzaa Strong G, or Strong, Chris, Brother Chris Woods, if I'm saying this right, Vyasa Nicolo. Excuse me if I'm murdering your names here. Brother Eni Herod, was this Kalfani? Global African Tribalism for Self-Government. That's the name there. Kenny Anderson, shout out to you. Jehudi Ma'at, Lessa Darcy, B. Mac, Lorenzo Heru, the Honorable Tony Rice, Love, what is this? Love Mifro. Again, I apologize if I'm murdering your names here. I just want to shout out all of you for, listening to me and for your feedback, saying here. So I don't see any questions. And so I assume I did such an excellent job that I explained everything, that it wasn't confusing. And so with that said, I just want to thank y'all for listening. If y'all have any questions or comments after the fact, after the live feed, of course, leave your comments and questions below. Visit the website, www.asarimhotep.com. I may do a part 3, and it may be a panel discussion. I'll invite some people to have a discourse, maybe about 45 minutes to an hour. And so, I'll let y'all know, if and when that happens. But thank you all. Salute. Peace and blessings. Y'all have a nice weekend. It's Black Music Month, so start studying some Black music history. And I'm out. Peace.